I am Ching, the CEO of Pictochart. We're a visual communication tool that has brought you the Business Storyteller Summit. I am so excited to be here today at this fireside chat together with Nancy Duarte, the CEO of Duarte, also known as the storyteller of the Valley, and she is the author of 6 best-selling books, one of which I still have here on my desk. Yay! And Nancy has been such a great mentor and inspiration to me personally. I've been following and learning so much from her ideas, her stories, and her books, and I cannot wait to dig into why she believes that influencing through stories has got such a big part to play in the world that we live in today. So Nancy, it's great to have you here.
It's so good to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nancy, I wanted to start off because with this question. You've been running Duarte for like 32 years now. That's amazing. It's so impressive. I'm curious about how you came across, influencing through stories, through empathy as a way for organizations, teams, and people to communicate successfully.
Well, I love that. 32 years is a long time. That's longer than most of the brands in the Valley. So
That's
the
right.
very first brand that we got work from was Apple. So we had popped down here to the Silicon Valley for my husband to go to school. And I thought this company was a joke. I was like, this is a dumb idea. And I said, look, if I can sell it, you can keep it. But if I can't sell what you make, you got to go get a real job. And so literally in one afternoon, I won contracts at Apple and Tandem, which is now HP, and NASA. And so I like to say, one of my other employees says it too, that presentations found me. It wasn't like I knew, the minute I was born, I wanted to do this. And so the cool thing is Apple was also the first company to hook up the projector to a computer at scale. So we used to do 35 millimeter slides. So as they grew and grew and grew, and then believe it or not, one of the best things that happened to me was a layoff that Apple did in 1993. So all my best and favorite customers at Apple just scattered all over the Silicon Valley, right when projectors were in almost every conference room. Like, people don't even remember that. You weren't even born then, I'm sure. You weren't even born then. So it's kind of tumbled through time. And then in 2000 or so, I just thought, you know what, we might actually be best in the world at this. Like, presentations were so terrible. We didn't have great tools like Pictochart. We didn't have tools that would help us think through things like that at all. And so it took like a hammer and an anvil to get a slide to look half decent. And so I thought, you know what, we've really kind of crushed it. And we decided, you know what, we would see what would happen if we just became just presentation experts. And then by 2008, that was when my Slideology book came out, which is about how businesses can use design to visualize information and content on slides. So that's kind of the rough history there.
Yeah, that's a great journey and a great story. And you've mentioned that you started out, and presentations found you, but now it's so much more about story. And obviously there's something that you discovered, about the power of like storytelling itself. And I've heard you in talks as well as your books mentioning this like over and over again. How do you come across like that story would be such a key pillar in the whole picture?
Yeah, it's CEOing is hard. You must know that because you're a CEO. And so it was hard. It was hard to carve out the time. And I was up at between 4 and 5 a.m. every day, and then just became a real student of story until between 11 and noon every day. And then I did my CEO job all afternoon and into the evening. It was about 3.5 years of a journey through story. And I knew I had a book called The 100 Greatest Speeches of All Time. And I knew that something about a really beautiful speech had a rhythm and a cadence to it. It had the same kind of rise and fall that a story has, that kind of cathartic tension and release of it. And so I studied just everything. I studied the archetypes of a story, the pattern of the story, the structure of a story, and found patterns in great speeches, but also found that story is a gateway to empathy. So the brain fires, like if I was telling a story, and we've shared a bunch of stories together at different times, and when I'm telling a story and you're listening, or you're telling one and I'm listening, our brains are firing at the exact same time, at the exact same pattern. So there's really powerful nature to it, that our brains and our body physiologically reacts to a story. And so if I can feel what you feel, I have empathy, and you and I have shared empathy. And that's the power of story. So folding it into any form of communication, whether it's an infographic or a speech or a blog, or I can even get my husband to do chores on the weekend if I use it the right way. So it's a powerful tool to, yeah, you should try it, Ching, it's awesome. It's a powerful tool for influence. It's really powerful.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I totally, see that as well. One of the things that, and how also, like, whenever I search for like your name on the internet, is definitely this TEDx talk that you did. So the secret structure of great talks, right? That had like garnered millions of views. And in it, like when I first watched it, and I was like, this makes a lot of sense. And then I started paying a lot of attention, to the structure of talks, like the way that you described. And then I tried to think also, whenever I had an important message that I needed to deliver to the organization. Not everything's like, super positive at times, but we need to move and inspire people towards like positive action. And I try to think whether or not I'll be able to, use that same structure that you've come up with. But for the people who are listening that aren't as familiar with your work, can you tell us more about the concept behind the talk and the role of storytelling?
Yeah. So this kind of went through my study of story, and story has an arc to it, and that arc is the rise of tension and the cathartic release of it. So I knew that these speeches had that rise and fall, and it had that kind of tension and release, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And so I spent hours, like I would just sit and think. I would go on hikes, I would walk, and I would just think, like, what is this pattern? What is this pattern? And I figured out that it was this rise and fall of the tension and gap between current realities and a better future. So what I noticed is that the greatest speeches of all time contrasted. Like, here's where we are today, here's our current state of the union, but here's where we could be. So it's the gap between what is, what could be, what is, what could be as a structural device. And then the talks all ended stating, here's what the world is going to look like with my idea adopted. And then they had an ending. So it was amazing, because I have actually analyzed almost all of the 100 greatest speeches of all time, and they all follow the pattern of this kind of rise and fall of contrast. And that's why it's influence. Like you create this kind of distaste for the current realities and a longing for what could be. Like you create longing for an alternate future, and then people are willing to let go of the current realities and in this quest for a better future. Yeah.
Totally. And also, how does someone try to influence, through story? And is it a critical skill for leaders? I personally know the answer because I cannot imagine, powering through like a very important, like, town hall talk without using stories these days. But I'm still very curious about how does one, get better at it? How does one influence through stories?
I love that question. And I think there's so many components of stories. So there's the rise and fall that you could use as a structural device. There's the 3-act structure. There is the middle act of any story is the messy middle. It's messy, it's hard. Like you think about poor Frodo, right? He had to fight all kinds of orcs. He gets impaled, he has to fight a spider. It's messy and hard. He had to climb all the way to Sauron. Hard. And that's the power of a story, though, right? We fall in love with this character, and then we root for them as they go through this terrible hardship. And then they ultimately, from at the end, they're changed because of everything they went through. And the thing that's so powerful about influencing through story is if I felt like you were stuck, Ching, I would think about, well, where is she stuck? And what's the lesson that I learned at the same time that was similar when I was stuck in the same way? So I could think and recall stories where I was stuck the same way you might be stuck. And I could tell that story and be very open about the messy middle, be very open about how hard it was, be very open about my moral choices, be very open about how I barely had the energy and I was so fatigued I couldn't keep going. And if I don't address that messy middle, I won't acknowledge how you feel right now. I wouldn't acknowledge empathetically that I understand how someone else is going through something similar.
Yeah.
That's the power of story. Some leaders don't want to talk about the messy middle. They want to show up and be like, I'm strong. They want to kind of beat their chest and pat their back and be like, I'm awesome. I'm just awesome.
Yeah.
And no, I don't think anyone wants to follow a leader like that.
No.
And so it's just really powerful to understand where you're at, understand what emotional fuel do you need to keep going, and do I have a story that'll give you that fuel?
Yeah. What you just said reminds me a lot about a couple of candidates that I had to hire. So we're a small organization. We're all remote right now, but we have we previously had a base and headquarter in Malaysia, so it's not been very easy to try to get the best people. One of the things that I do is whenever I go into an interview with a candidate, I immediately start off with like the most like the most vulnerable like sharings basically of what's going on, why I need help, and a couple of the candidates have said that is so refreshing because sometimes, like you said, when they go into organizations and interviews, it's all about like, I'm doing all of these things like well, and everything's great at the organization. And I'm also very curious, like, is vulnerability something that leaders need in order to do storytelling well? Or do you see it as like it's an optional nice to have? Or
I mean, if
what's
you
your
think
perspective?
about, I love that question, because if you think about why the candidates might be attracted to you, is they know they can come in and solve a problem that creates meaning in the lives of a lot of people. And so by the nature of a story itself, like the fact that I would have to be like, hi, I'm this likable person. And then the messy middle is life is really hard, right? I have to go there and I have to say, I had this conflict, I had this thing, and it was hard, it was terrible, but this is how I overcame it. To do something like that means you have to show up at work and admit that you're flawed. I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect. This has been a hard season, and I have employees that are hurting, and it's just hard. I have to show up and be vulnerable. I have to show up and be transparent. And the power of story is that it does create an emotional bond. So just the nature of a story. So if someone wants to become a storyteller, they have to be vulnerable, they have to be transparent, or they're not telling an effective story. To tell a really effective story, you have to say, I'm flawed. I made this mistake, or this terrible roadblock was put in front of me, and here's how I overcame it. So if they're not comfortable showing up and talking that way, the story may not work for them, but you have to kind of own it. So we've been on kind of this story parade now for way over a decade. And we're just now seeing in the C-suite of the top brands, like the Fortune 50, almost, I can't say almost all, but many, many of the brands there, the CEOs are adopting story now, but it took a long time for them to understand that you actually get a stronger following if you show up a little bit flawed than you do when you're trying to be perfectly perfect. So there's interesting phenomenon for sure.
Yeah, and probably driven, like you said, driven by all of the stories that are also going out there influencing people. So I didn't have the courage, to be honest, to share my flaws like openly on LinkedIn, etc. Like it wasn't part of me. Like I didn't have enough courage. But seeing how other people do it, and I learned so much from like when people share their own flaws rather than like they share and flaunt their own successes, and that helped me. So I think there's something that you've also probably done and helped the value there.
People are looking for meaning. So many things are broken down, like the family unit, community, churches. Like there's just no gathering place anymore, and people are putting a lot of pressure on leaders of organizations to meet their social needs, to meet their emotional needs, to meet their spiritual needs, to make meaning, and to have to solve all of the world's most critical problems. And the platform for CEOs is getting more and more demanding. So I think story actually is one of the keys that will create a community amongst employees that has a lot of meaning. So
No, I love how you just said that. Like 2020 has not been a normal year, and like you said, it's just accentuated that need. Like if there are people who are still like battling whether or not they should be more vulnerable, I think they should take that last advice that you just said. Okay. And Nancy, so do you believe that anyone can be a great presenter? Is it a learnable skill, or do you think that the best ones are just born with it?
I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
I've never been one to not jump up to the front of the class and say something. Like even as a little kid, in the fifth grade, I like danced the hula in front of
Oh
everyone,
wow.
right? So
Oh wow.
standing up in front of
Yeah.
others
Yeah.
and embarrassing myself was never a problem for me. But what's interesting is about people who are naturally extroverted, I think they wing it a lot. I think they show up with less thoughtful content than someone who's nervous. Because someone who's nervous and hates to present, they're going to over prepare. They're going to prepare
That's
a
right.
lot,
That's
and
right.
they may shake in their boots, but their content is more well liked. So I remember we'd only worked with TED for about the first 2 years, and I was in a breakfast gathering, and I asked people, what do you miss the most about TED? Because they went on to TED.com. So it used to be very private. TED.com came out, and then everything was quite a bit more polished. And I remember the longtime TEDster said, I just want to see that really smart scientist. I just want him shaking in his boots. I want him terrified. I want to see it, but I want his content to be amazing. Like they just want everyone to show up and be their natural, true selves. If you're scared, sure you're scared. If you're not, I just have found. So my husband's more introverted, and he is a stronger communicator. He has better content. I can say what I think are the same words almost, and he could make someone moved almost to tears. Whereas people are just like, oh yeah, Nancy waved her hands and, ah. So I do think it can be learned. I think it's a skill that other people have to work hard at. So my advice is, I think extroverts need to slow down and focus on the content and empathy. And I think introverts need to work hard to get over their fear. And then I think that'll improve kind of both sides of the house there.
Yeah, yeah. I'm loving, what you're saying, because it's the exact same thing that I, observe as well. And you just like managed to summarize it quite succinctly, because it is true that the extroverts, while they don't have the fear, but they, like you said, they wing it. So in a sense, in a sense, the content could be, like you said, it's less refined. And those
they think charisma will carry them, right? They think, oh,
that's
I'll just
right.
so lovable and charismatic. I don't have to say anything of value, and it's not. It's just not true.
But it's somehow true in a sense, like, some people, like they do get away with their charisma, I have to say. But
I would agree.
Yeah. So it's better to have, great content and then charisma, then you go very far. Oh, okay. And every story has a hero, right, as a central figure. And in business communication especially, I'm curious, like who is the hero of, that particular presentation or that communication itself? Yeah.
I think every story has, a hero and a villain and a mentor. Those are kind of the top three classic story archetypes. And I think when you're a presenter, it's really easy to fall into the trap to think I'm the hero, right? I'm up on a stage, I'm well lit, I'm standing on a platform above everyone else, and I'm talking the most. Because in a story or in a movie, usually the hero is in the film the most. They're the most, they're the central figure, it's called. And it's so easy to be obsessing about what you're going to say. You're nervous, you're preparing, you're rehearsing, you're getting ready. And then you get up on the stage and you feel like you're the most important person in the room. And it's really easy to feel that way because it's a lot of work to do a presentation well. But in reality, you're not the hero in the room. You're the archetype of a mentor. And so a mentor in myths and movies, they help the hero get unstuck. They're there with the perfect tool, the right gift to help the hero. So who's the hero then? Well, the hero is the audience. Because if you have an idea, you're standing on stage and you're trying to convey this idea, if everyone in the room walks out without adopting your idea, you lose. So your audience actually holds all the power in the room. It's their story. You're a moment in their bigger story, and you're trying to influence your audience. So they're the hero of your idea, and your idea is to help them get unstuck in their journey. And sometimes I think we forget that. We forget to be empathetic about, who am I talking to? What does a day look like? What's a walk in their shoes? How hard is this idea going to be? how are they going to resist it? Because sometimes the villain is also the audience, right? Because the villain is in their mind. They're saying, I don't want to do this. You didn't convince me. I'm going to entrench myself against you, you know? So they could either be your hero or they could be your villain, all based on how well you communicate what needs to get done and the importance of this alternate future, this alternate reality that you're trying to get them to adopt.
Okay, so it's important to reframe because, like you said, lots of people would step into that and, you know, this is my story, this is my, you know, message, and therefore they see themselves as the hero.
Yeah.
But it's so important to kind of like, you know, reframe that to say, no, that is, I do have something to share, but it is your journey and what you're going to do with this message after, you know, you hear it. That's really powerful.
It changes your stance, I think, too, from thinking it's all about me to realizing, wait, I am completely not successful if I don't make it all about them.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. And I also have, you know, a tricky question, although we kind of like covered that a little bit earlier. For an amazing presentation, what do you think is most important? The content, the slides, or the delivery? If you had to like rank them or like choose which ones to go with.
It's a kind of a trick question from someone who makes beautiful visualization tool.
I know.
But you know what? You think about even the visuals that anyone puts in a Picto chart, they're not going to be any good unless the framing devices, the content, the structure, what are they putting next to each other? What's the flow and the order of it? You can make it look as beautiful as you want, but it's kind of like what we were just saying. If it doesn't have great meaning, it's not going to do anything. So I personally feel like it's content, how it's delivered, and then the visuals. Now, delivery is an interesting one. Delivery is not just the human form, like your vocal variety, how you move your arms, you know, how you have eye contact. It's not just that. Visuals, delivery is also the visual nature of the words you form, the concepts, the metaphors, that all can be supported by a visual. So if you think about when you're making the content, you could just be like, partnership. I'm just doing partnership. Okay, I'm just going to go grab a picture of a handshake in front of a globe. Just going to go and grab the most obvious dorky picture that you can imagine because we have partnership. But if you spend some time thinking about the concept and the content, that metaphor can become so much more beautiful. Like a metaphor for a partnership could be, we're so alike, we're like peas in a pod, or we're so different, we're like salt and pepper, but when we come together, we make something else more savory. Or we could say, I'm like Ginger Rogers, you're like Fred Astaire, and as we dance together, I can dance backwards, you can dance backwards, dance frontwards. Like there's so many better ways to say it. So the visual you would go and pursue to assemble is different based on what is the nuance of our partnership? Are we a pair of socks? Are we, like, what are we? And then you would go and source a different image and a different visual based on empathetically understanding what is the best metaphor. But you have to think about that. You don't just run and put in Google the word partnership, because I guarantee a handshake in front of a globe is going to come up. And you want to be different than, better than, greater than your competitors. You don't want to look or smell like them. So if you sit and mind map and think and think and think and think and go for the second, third, or fourth idea that you have, you'll get more and more unique in how you represent your visuals. And that's the most important part, right? You want to be different than, better than your competitors. You want to rise above them. You want to have someone go, that was clever. Like when they get a picture card, you want them to be like, whoa, that was clever. I never would have thought of doing it that way. Well, you're not going to get there by just going straight to a illustration thing and just looking up the word partnership. You have to really peel it back and brainstorm it. And that way what you make will become more memorable, but it's really in the conceptual thinking and less in finding the graphic.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. So what tips do you have? Because that's something I'm also very curious about, like, you know, for people to position themselves, you know, like you said, to be unique, to be different. And you mentioned something to do also with like the visual representations, but what about that like content? So delivery, I know everyone's unique, right? Like there's no way, as much as I watch all of your videos, like I would not be able to emulate you basically, because everyone's got a different like form of like delivery. But then when it comes to content, is there something that, like we could all try in order to yeah, position ourselves and think differently?
I think brainstorms are really important because I think you can brainstorm by yourself and that's really powerful. We'll use a mind map where there's the
Yeah,
main concept and then you just do like free association.
yeah,
You just have to say, I don't know why I thought of a sock, but it doesn't make any sense. But I thought of a sock. And you just
yeah,
write down the word sock, and then you branch off that, and you branch off that.
right,
So that's
right.
one way. The other way is to get in with a group of other people and just say
Mm-hmm.
yes and. It's an old improv. Like that's how they do
Mm-hmm.
improv training for humor and
Mm-hmm.
comedy is they say
Yeah.
yes and over and over,
Okay.
and then you'll find something that is a derivative of the concept, but it's
Mm-hmm.
more clever and something that someone else
Mm-hmm.
would have thought of. I find a lot of things in biology and in creation, like how
Mm-hmm.
does bacteria work? Is that a concept for
Mm-hmm.
something? What about algae? What about the algae that can take a granite rock and within
Mm-hmm.
years turn a granite rock back to dirt? Like, what is
Mm-hmm.
that called? Like, you just think about a redwood
Mm-hmm.
tree and how it functions and
Mm-hmm.
how deep its roots go and how like some things are really just one great big plant and it can take up acres and acres and acres, but it's one big network of one plant, right? So there's a whole lot of things in biology too that work in a
Mm-hmm.
really beautiful way because everything was
Mm-hmm.
created so beautifully different,
Mm-hmm.
and unexpectedly, an unexpected business metaphor a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times in there.
Okay.
Take
And that would
the birch tree is one great big tree. Well, there is a tree
you
that's one great
yeah,
big network of just one tree. I'll
yeah.
have to remember what it is.
Yeah, you must spend a lot of time in nature. Be an observer of like what's going on in order to pick up all of this, devices to help with like content and storytelling. But that also leads me on to the next one. Like, do you think there are good like tools and devices for people to be using, like repetition, metaphors, imagery, familiar references? You've mentioned a couple of them, and how we can go out, in the nature and try to find them. But do you also think that they're overly used? Like how do we stay kind of like a good check and balance, in terms of like how much of that to use within our
Yeah.
communication? Yeah,
Yeah. I think every industry has its own set of cliche, right?
yeah,
Like, yeah, the security industry overuses the lock metaphor.
yeah.
Like, okay, unlock, lock, unlock, so there's some
Yeah.
industries that have the classic industry kind of metaphors. So to
Mm-hmm.
stand out from the competition. So what we do as a firm when we get a new client is we will go pretty deep into the website, pretty deep into as much sales materials as we could get, and really study the competitors of all the different
Mm-hmm.
brands, from the colors to the imagery to metaphors to
Mm-hmm.
how they represent themselves, how they frame themselves in the industry.
Yeah.
And then our top goal is to be different
Mm-hmm.
than, better than, greater than. So we stand
Mm-hmm.
out to the competitors. And so you want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure you're not confusing. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
use a very
Yeah.
similar lock to your
Yeah.
competitors, you won't stand out. So you
Yeah.
have to do some research for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I think it's just making your point really clear. You also mentioned
Mm-hmm.
repetition, which is verbal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we call, when you repeat yourself, we call that verbal highlighting. Like
Mm-hmm.
we want your attention drawn to this. So we
Mm-hmm.
may have an executive say it once, say it twice, say it a third time. And in their mind,
Mm-hmm.
we're teaching them how to put a yellow highlighter through it. And
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
audience, sure enough, is like, oh, he just said, oh, he said again. Oh, this stands
Oh.
out to me because now he said it the third time, or she.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's certain things that you want to do or say or visualize that people will remember when you're done. We
Mm-hmm.
found that when you use repetition or a
Mm-hmm.
startling image or an emotional image or a metaphorical one that's powerful, those get the tweets. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
want your message to spread, the powerful visuals are the ones that spread the powerful messages, the phrases.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a really important phrase that you say that
Mm-hmm.
you want to get tweeted, say
Mm-hmm.
that phrase slowly and pause. And then when you pause, they're like, oh, that's tweetable. And then they tweet it. So there's so much power. Like, they're like, that must have been important. I'm going to tweet it. And it's like, wow. So you really can. It sounds weird, but you really can control what gets picked up and what doesn't. And it's just a matter of how you verbally, visually, and fundamentally, physically deliver what you have to say.
Absolutely. Like, I love that tip. Like, if you want to get someone to tweet about it, just say it really slowly, leave an awkward, pause at the end of it, so that people will pick it up and they have time to type.
Exactly. That's the big trick. And it works. If you look at speeches, it works.
Yeah, great one. And also, because I've also been reading, about data story, the book that's on my desk right now, and I would like to know more about like how we could try to incorporate data into our presentations. I personally, like, before knowing all of this, like, for me it was, okay, what's our like top line revenue, what's the bottom line, and then like, what goes, and that's it. It's just like charts. But recently I've started to be a bit more intentional, but I would love to hear how, what are your tips to try to, incorporate like data into, mundane like presentation, so-called.
I love that. Yeah, it's interesting because data is delivered one of two ways. It's either flat and static, or you have the opportunity to show one bar, a second bar, a third bar chart. Like you have an opportunity to reveal it slowly over time.
Yeah.
And when you have a static graphic, it's less, it's more difficult, say, to create an emotional building of suspense and releasing it. But a sequence of static charts can also tell a very powerful story. So it really is about the rise and fall. We kind of started there. So it's interesting. Yes. Right? It's about the shape of a chart kind of shows its plot. Did it go up and then fall? Did it go up and was it a comedy? Like all of those shapes that we talk about are the shape of a story plot. And the shape that a data chart takes on tells you, was this a happy ending? Is it a sad ending? Are we in the middle of the messy middle? And do I need everyone to rally to change the data trajectory around? And you have to think through, like, where are we in the story? Because if it's keeping going high up and to the right, it's probably everyone's cooking and everything's going great. So you have to think about where are we? And where do we want to be? There's a real powerful story in there by where Scott Harrison, I sat through a presentation of his and I had just written the book and I was like, he nailed it. So there were three or four bar charts going up. And then it showed a massive dip because of 2008, right? And then it showed a recovery and then it kind of went a little flat. And he said, we thought we would do this much, but we did this much. And then we did this. And the whole place was just screaming like, ah! And he could have just, if he'd thrown the whole chart up there at once, we already would have had the ending. But instead, he told the narrative, and these charts built, and the whole audience was already like excited. And then we were sad because there was a dip. And then we were like out of our seats clapping at a bar chart. So it's just really a powerful tool to not just show it all at once, but to show it over time is another powerful way. So either show a sequence of charts, like if it was an infographic, a tall infographic, just show the chart, build the narrative over time. You could do that, or you could click it through slides and build suspense and surprise over time. Yeah.
That's a really, really good tip. I think sometimes, like, especially for us, because we're so used to, let's summarize this and condense it, then you try to like give the beginning and the end all in the same slide, like you just said. And that's not helpful because you then, like you miss the entire messy middle and, what could have been, and you're totally right about like building the crescendo, like towards, towards that. That's a great one. And I'm also curious, like, what are some of the biggest and most common mistakes that people make when putting together, a presentation?
I think the biggest one is that we make it about ourselves. It's kind of that hero mentor question from earlier. I think a lot of people, we get so caught up in what we have to do to meet this deadline and be ready for a presentation or get ready for that meeting or get ready to present to the board at a meeting that we forget to pause and think about them, right? Because my career is at stake, or my platform or influence is at stake. And it's so easy to get in our own head about everything I want it to become instead of really thinking about what I need you to have it become. So I think the biggest flaw is low empathy, whether it's telling the story with low empathy, picking visuals. You wouldn't believe the role visuals play, especially right now with this resurgence finally of people wanting equality. Like, wow, I mean, the way we pick images, the way we deliver it, all of those things have an impact. So I would definitely say not pausing before you build your content and think about who you're talking to. That's the biggest mistake people make, for sure.
Okay. And, you know, even in terms of like empathy, like, have you, how would I put it? Like, have you had steps and, or frameworks sort of like to coach and help people through, you know, building empathy when it comes to their story? Like, I'm very curious because for me, I'm naturally empathetic to a certain extent. Like it comes natural, but I have to say that working with different people, it hasn't been that way. Like for some, I've had to try to think about like how could I help them, you know, to influence them so that they would then, as they're communicating as well to their teams, or the vision, they're translating the vision that I've given to the teams, and I needed them to not just give it like a dictatorship, you know, like but to to also have a bit of empathy through that. So I'm curious if there was something that you help people with, like, you know, when
each of my books has models all the way back to Slideology in 2008. I think there was a list of 8 or 10 questions you can ask yourself about who you're speaking to, and then resonate. That whole, a lot of that book is a model for empathy. Illuminate, 100% of that model is an empathy model. And part of the reason that all of my books have models for empathy is I think for a long time I was that person that you're describing. I was that person who would just show up and just be like, let's just go. Come on, let's just go. We just, hello, let's go. Instead of really understanding how people would really feel about going. And I was raised by a narcissistic mom, and a narcissist is missing the empathy gene. And there's a lot of research now that says that the daughter of a narcissistic mother will grapple with finding empathy and will, you know, and so that's why I was like, I became like, when we first started the business, I became a student of empathy because I thought I can't teach these people to be effective communicators if they are not other-centric. And so all of the books all have more than one model to kind of get in their head so that they can be empathetic, whether it's a leader, an individual contributor, a keynoter, like whatever it is that you're trying to do as you communicate. All of the books have some model. Even Data Story is a model for empathizing with executives. So that has a model in there about how to communicate up. Because data, a lot of times you've made it, you're trying to get a decision made from data. So you're kind of teeing it up the food chain. So so all of them have models for empathy.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. But thanks for sharing the story. I wouldn't have been able to tell at all. You've always come across as one of the people to me that has been the most deliberate in your choice of words. And it's always like come across extremely empathetic. So I wouldn't have been able to tell that at all. But okay, Nancy, it has been great having you here. And I'm sure, you know, the audience has learned so much from you as I have as well. Thank you again for joining us here at the Business Storyteller Summit.
Of course. Mwah. I adore you.